Inevitably, at some point in your business, someone is going to say these words to you. Hey, you got to niche down. You got to niche down your business. You got to pick a niche and figure out what drilling down in your offer looks like. In fact, I've probably talked about it on the podcast, and it's not bad advice. But is it the best advice for your business? Is the answer to growing and scaling your business found in the power of niche? And is there such a thing as niching down too quickly and actually losing out money long-term for your business? Hey, my name's Blake Benz. I'm the host of the Good Advice Podcast. We're going to be talking some good advice today. We don't do any fluff on this podcast. We just dive into the actionable, practical things that you need to know to grow your business. Before we dive in, we do have a word for one of the amazing businesses that sponsors the podcast. Of course, if you ever thought about sponsoring on the show, you can always reach out, Blake at goodadvicecoaching.com. We also have a Patreon at our website, patreon.com/goodadvice. And you can support the podcast for as little as the price of a cup of coffee, which these days could mean anything, but it's only about $5. So you can check that out as well. Thank you to all of our sponsors and supporters of the podcast. I really appreciate you. Let's dive into this episode. And first, hear a word from one of our amazing sponsors. Hey, have you been thinking about your health insurance plan for this next year? Maybe you just jumped into the world of entrepreneurship and you're thinking, geez, is it possible to have a good insurance plan if I'm no longer working for a business? Maybe you're even running a business and you're thinking about what does it look like to have an affordable group plan for your employees? Well, I want to tell you about Optimum Health Insurance. This is a customized healthcare plan for you and your family, and since 2018, they've been helping people get awesome, affordable healthcare coverage for really nothing at all. It's easy, it's hassle-free, and frankly, they're different from the big insurance companies that you might talk to. And crazy enough, you might even be paying less than what you've paid at a previous job when you were on some company health insurance plan. If you want to find out more and save money on your health insurance, you absolutely need to go check out OptimumHealthInsurancePlan.com. That's OptimumHealthInsurancePlan.com. That's today's sponsor. Enjoy this episode. All right, let's talk about it. Let's talk about the power of niche, which I think this was even a previous episode that I did. I think I even did an episode that was called The Power of Niche or the Impact of Niche or something like that. And let's just get some things out in the open from the get-go. Niche is not a bad thing. Niche is a great thing for your business. You know, when you think about the focus of your business, when you think about the direction you want to take your business, it can be really valuable to slow down and really think about who is my customer. In fact, I just had this conversation with one of my customers yesterday. I had this conversation with another customer 2 weeks ago. I've been having this conversation often with people over the years saying, hey, you know, you're selling to all these different people. What does it look like to niche down who you work with? So it's not a bad thing by any means. It's a great piece of advice for you in your business. And it helps you think about, you know, for example, like your marketing. When you know more clearly who you're selling to, everything becomes easier in terms of your messaging, how you talk about your product, the language that you use. A good example is a customer of mine sells a driver training passenger brake. And his primary customer has been school districts with a driver training, I don't want to say facility, like a driver training division within the school. So because he's really keyed in on his niche, it makes it much easier then when we talk about email marketing or reaching out to prospective customers. The language is so much more intentional because we know who his customer is. That's not the case always with everybody because often, you know, we don't know who that exact customer is, especially when you're young in business. You know, many times you're just trying to take cash anywhere you can. You're just trying to make that next sale. So niching down could be a really powerful thing for your business. But I want to go a little different today. I want to talk about It's funny because really a couple of weeks ago, I was in this conversation with someone and I said, I'm learning more and more how in trying to simplify things, we remove the nuance of things. So let me give a good example here. Let's say that you're cooking a meal. Let's say you're not a very good chef. You're not a very good cook. You're cooking dinner for your family. And you pull up a recipe online. Well, if you haven't cooked before, many people can relate with, you see the picture of the recipe, they clearly lay out, add this much, add a tablespoon of this spice, cook it on this temperature, what have you. Many of us can relate with the feeling of looking at your plate at the end of cooking it and comparing it to the picture in the recipe and thinking, what the heck? What happened here? Why doesn't mine look like that? Well, it's because only when you're cooking often or you cook over time that you begin to learn a little bit of the nuance of cooking. A good example is like when you cook eggs. Many people who've cooked 1,000 eggs know that when you're cooking eggs, it is handled much more easily when you cook on a very low temperature than when you cook on like medium or medium high. You're going to burn your eggs. Another example is, throwing garlic in a pan. Garlic can burn rather easily. And so typically if you're putting like oil down, you're putting onions down, the garlic often comes later. Usually you cook with the onion first and add the garlic after the fact. Now, I'm not, I haven't been watching the show The Bear, so I don't know anything beyond like those two details. And some of you listening, you might even be an expert at cooking. You might send me an angry email that's like, hey, actually, let me tell you something. That's not when the garlic goes in. Who knows? But point being, there's nuance to cooking that you don't always get from reading a recipe. And in the same way, running a business, I think sometimes we oversimplify what it looks like to run a business. I think we see this a lot on social media where people are selling a product to business owners. The worst offenders of this are things like, hey, just send this one email. Here's the email script, the only email script you need. And it ignores the nuance of your buyer and the time of day, the time of week, the time of year. For some people, like my customer who sells to schools, the conversation is very different in the summertime than it is in the wintertime, than it is in the early spring. So there's a nuance to engaging with your customers that I think sometimes we miss. And I say all that to say that while niche is incredibly important, I think we would be missing the nuance of understanding who your customer is and the process of figuring out what you sell if you hurry too quickly into niche. So this episode is going to feel a little bit like a whirlwind in the sense of bouncing back and forth. And that's not to confuse anybody or frustrate anybody. It's just to help people understand that having been in business for several years, having had many conversations with people over the years, that there's never been like one piece of advice that I've given that could be applied to literally every other situation, except for like very generic stuff, like take care of your customers, take care of your employees, like things like that. Do the right thing. These are all just more like adages to live by. They're not necessarily like specific words of wisdom. So let's get into why I've been talking about this lately. This is more for the person who you're still... Well, actually, I was about to say it's for the person figuring out what you're doing. And then as I was about to say that, I thought, well, actually, I'll come back to that in a second. Let's just start with the new business owner, okay? When you start a business for the first time, when you're selling something for the first time, more often than not, you don't fully have it fleshed out, informed in your mind. Now, you know generically what you're selling. If a family member or a friend was like, "What are you doing now?" You could probably say, "Yeah, I do this now. I sell this." And you would know like the industry term for it. You'd be able to describe it. You know what it is. But until you've actually been in a multitude of sales conversations, until you've really like keyed in your offer, which is different from what you do, by the way. I think as you get better at sales, you start to understand this is my offer. Offer isn't something that is like a highly constructed scientific thing, by the way, but it's being really clear on if my customer is going to give me X amount of dollars, they're getting Y service specifically. And I think there is a marketing flair to that of knowing how to talk about it, how to describe it. And when I say marketing, I don't mean like with pizzazz. I think it's really like you key in on exactly what your price points are. You key in on exactly what your buyer gets from you. So let me give you a couple of examples of this. What I sell now with Good Advice is different in the sense of when I first started out with Good Advice 6 years ago, I felt pretty confident that I could help business owners with their businesses. In terms of the process, like working it down to like, here is the way that I do it, I was still figuring it out. And even now with like Podcastable, it's very easy for me to talk about my services. I was on a phone call with someone today. They said, "Hey, so like, what does it look like? What do you do?" And I said, "Yep, audio. We do audio up to an hour at this rate. We do video up at this rate. If you want social media, it costs this much." And that's pretty much what it is. In and out, 10, 15 seconds, I'd really said exactly what it was. Which, by the way, there's a way to do even that conversation where people are interested in knowing more rather than just like, sharing the works. Different conversation though. Point being, I think what happens when you're new to business is you have to give yourself a little bit of grace to figure out what the heck you're doing. To figure out what rises to the top. And even that, by the way, I had someone on my podcast a few years ago. It was a business that sold, I think it was like journals for like meetings or something. I don't know exactly what it was, but the journal or like the meeting tool was like a side product. It was not like the main thing. The main thing was like some kind of consultation thing. But over time, customers started being like, "Hey, we really like this like meeting planner thing. Like that's what we really would want to pay for." Well, the company realized that and they went all in on that meeting planner. Like that's what they built their business around because they realized, wow, people really like this. They didn't set out to do that though. They figured that out because they keyed in on their customers, what their customers were saying, how they were describing the product, their customers' perspective on what they were getting the most value from. So understand that when you start a business, you're going to have in your mind an idea of what you really think people love. It's kind of like if you ever watched like Kitchen Nightmares, you always have like the restaurant owner who like the main thing on the menu, they're like, "Oh, people love this." And then you talk to customers, no one loves it. No one orders it. It's actually only on the menu because the owner loves it, In the same way, we have those same biases when we start a business, when we go to market with our offer. We personally were transformed by our experience with this like one thing. It's really important to us. It's really special to us. And we don't understand that that is a bias of our own, We assume that everyone else is going to love this, want this, gotta have this, etc. But once you like get out there and you do business, you start talking to people, you start to realize, hey, this thing that I thought was like the linchpin of my business, people really don't care about it. And what they really care about is this other tiny thing that I never actually thought about. That's actually part of the story of how Podcastable came about. Was I had people reaching out who were so indifferent to good advice, but they were like, you're the podcast guy. Like you understand podcasts. Hey, can you help me with my podcast? Like people who couldn't give a rip. I even had people who knew me, who had known me for a while, who were like, hey, so I actually don't really know what you do aside from the podcast, but can you help me with my podcast? So that I keyed in on that and noticed something. I thought, okay, it's interesting that people are really resonating with the podcast, which is actually a bit ironic because the podcast, what I talk about the podcast is not any different from like the actual work I do with my customers. And so it's the same stuff. It's just in a different format. But point being, I noticed that people were really seeming to like the podcast and were really seeming, in business, you have to fight for every ounce of trust and credibility and brand in your customers. And I started to notice that people were reaching out without me needing to, I don't say prove myself, but it was like the trust was already there. The reputation was already there. So it was really like I would be remiss if I wasn't taking advantage of this opportunity to see where this podcast business can go. So 2 other data points that have happened in the last month, 3 actually. And this isn't just for like the brand new business owner. I think that's why I said I wanted to come back to this, because I had a conversation that came up actually probably about 2 months ago. Steve Lay, local business owner, runs Equity Business Solutions, amazing business owner, very consistent advertiser on the podcast. You've certainly heard his name for the show. Well, Steve and I were talking and he mentioned, kind of joking offhand, he was like, yeah, I don't have a niche. I haven't needed to. Like, it's just the business is growing. Like, I just haven't really had a reason to niche down. It reminded me of someone else I talked to, Damon Burton, who runs a business called SEO National, probably the best known SEO business in the country. He's worked with Utah Jazz, all sorts of like major organizations. Well, Damon posted on Facebook, I guess 3 or 4 weeks ago. He's been in business for 19 years, by the way. And what he posted was, and again, this is probably the best known SEO guy in the nation. Probably has the most compelling results. And his price, by the way, it reflects that. I think he's around like $3,000 a month, something like that. Well, what Damon posted was, pretty much kind of like laughing, like, yeah, I've in 19 years, I've never chosen a niche. Like, I just focus on doing good work, and people from all sorts of industries keep coming back to me. So here's 2 great business owners, Damon Burton and Steve Lay, neither of which have niche down. That's interesting to me. We talk about the nuance of running a business. When I meet people who aren't necessarily doing what other people are doing, that's interesting. I perk up a bit. I'm like, okay, this is interesting. Like, what's happening here? And I think what's special about both of those businesses is both of them have really keyed in on a great, valuable product. Steve has a great business, many happy customers. Damon has many happy customers. And I think sometimes where we go is we don't realize that our business really isn't all that compelling. And rather than improving the quality of our service, we point to these other things that feel like they feel less painful to address. Oh, I need a niche down. Oh, I need a niche. And it's like, well, no, the issue isn't that you haven't niched down. The issue is that your product doesn't do what you say it does. The issue is that people aren't being wowed by what you're selling them. And instead of coming to terms with that, instead of being honest about your baby that you've put all this time in, this blood, sweat, and tears into, it's easier to say, well, I just need a niche than it is to realize, hey, I'm selling the same thing that every other person is selling. Now, if you're listening and that's you, understand, especially if you haven't listened to me long term, understand my heart. I am not looking to wound anybody or cause anybody to be like, all right, well, I'm done. I quit. So understand that all of us in business has had to look in the mirror and say, I need to do better. I remember when I started Good Advice, I thought I would be a multimillionaire very quickly because I thought no one does what I do. No one sells what I sell. And I was in for an incredibly rude awakening because all the certifications I had probably $10,000, $15,000 worth of certifications. I realized that on day one, none of my potential customers cared about that. And I also realized that not only were consultants or coaches a dime a dozen, you can throw a coin in any direction, you're going to hit one. But I also realized what I thought was incredibly special and qualified about my own skill set was incredibly dwarfed by some amazing professionals who were out there doing an incredible job. So it's not something to be shameful about. It is a sobering reminder of, is it about my ego or is it about my customer? Because we often say it's about our customer when it's really about us, right? And our own accomplishments. But if it truly is about your customer, you'll eat the fish and spit out the bones. You'll take what you can and say, you know what? My product's not where it needs to be right now, but I'm willing to make it better. With Podcastable, like the video editing, for example, for someone's podcast, I have spent many an hour on YouTube over the years. And this was just for my show, many an hour trying to figure out how to make it look better, how to edit it, all these different things, because I really wanted it to be a good show. The equipment that I have for a typical episode is around $1,000. I don't spend that every episode. I have a couple of things that together have cost about $1,000. I've spent money on the show because I've listened to other podcasts and been like, ooh, mine does not sound that good. And it's funny even now doing like social media content, Facebook will show you like memories, like things that you posted forever ago. I cringe at some of the stuff that I posted. I'm like, oh my gosh, like my background is filthy. I got random things piled up. There's a desk in the background that has like all this crap on it. Like, what was I thinking? What was I doing? But again, it's not anything to be ashamed over. It's just, as long as you're improving, as long as you're focused on making the quality of the product better, I think that's a reflection that you really do care about your customer. Steve and Damon, again, they have something in common. They both do great work. They do great work. So think about that. And if you feel like your business is struggling, is it because you haven't niched down? Or is there opportunities to grow? Is there opportunities to do it better? Is there an opportunity to, not necessarily even recognize your product needs to improve, but understanding that maybe your buyers, maybe your customers are less interested in like the main thing you sell. And instead they're signaling, hey, we really love this other thing that you do. We really love this other thing that you sell. I think sometimes in entrepreneurship, we're so keen to do it, like be the ones to do it for the first time. We're so keen to like trailblaze. And, when you think about, you may not have, I don't know if you've heard this expression before, but There's an expression in just like entrepreneurship about when everyone's digging for gold, be the person selling the shovel, like really understanding what people want and what people need. And I think in this process, we sometimes as entrepreneurs, this is especially true like in just the startup world, by the way, like there's so much press and attention on like new ventures and new things that I think we don't always appreciate the more traditional things that you can actually do really well with. Like I have a customer who's an electrician. He's been an electrician for 30 years. He's a really great electrician. It would be insanity for him to wake up one day and be like, how can I be a new kind of electrician? How can I do this different? He's just really good at what he does. You know, and if everyone's digging for gold, you don't need to invent something new to help them dig for gold. You just need to sell a shovel that does what you say it does. You know, it doesn't snap in half. It doesn't break. The end doesn't fall off. You know, it does what you say it will do. And it's a great, reliable shovel. You know, you think about those tools that you have in your garage, if you're a tool person, and you think about the one that you love, like the hammer you love, or the drill that you love. It's lasted forever. It did what it said it was going to do. So it's not about trailblazing and creating something new. Sometimes it's just about, again, I'm going to go all in on making sure that what I sell is a great product. And again, if you don't know what that is okay. I was reminded of this from a business guy, Chris Do. I've really enjoyed Chris Do's content. I've been listening to a lot of it. A lot of what he talks about really resonates with me. It affirms a handful of things that I've been really thinking for myself. One thing Chris Do had posted today, and it's kind of what got me back to thinking about this. He said, you know, when you start a business, you need to give yourself some room to play a little bit. You know, before you go all in on like, this is the strategy, this is the niche, this is what have you, you got to give yourself a little room to play a little bit. And I think that's true. I think sometimes we have an inkling of what we're good at and what we can sell, but we don't have the whole picture. We can't see the whole picture. So getting out there and playing a little bit. And I say this a lot, by the way, I have a Tuesday morning group here locally. We get about 15, 20 business owners who show up to it. And it's all people who they're just trying to grow their business. And I've had people in the past come to that who were embarrassed that they didn't have their business drilled down better. They didn't have their offer drilled down better. And I always try to be encouraging to those people because the advice I give them is, you know, first of all, don't expect yourself to know all the answers immediately. But second of all, like you need that space a little bit. You need that blank canvas a little bit to play and see like what you like and what you don't like. When I first started Good Advice, I was all in on these like strategic plans. And what I realized after doing a handful of them is I really don't like strategic plans. They're a really long and lengthy process. And this might have been also like being new in business and like the quality of my customers, but it was like, I feel like I'm holding my customers more accountable than they're holding themselves. And like, I don't like the feeling of being a babysitter. So having to learn over that time that like, hey, this thing that I was playing with, I don't even really like this very much. Funny enough, you know, playing around and seeing like, what do I like? I realized very early on, hey, I really like podcasting. I had never even really listened to podcasts before then. I didn't even really know much about podcasts. Isn't that kind of funny? And I was like, hey, I kind of like this. I kind of enjoy this. You know, maybe I'll do more of this. Again, I wouldn't have known that if I hadn't given myself the space to play. And here's honestly probably the best advice I can give you as we're wrapping up this episode. It's hard to have room to play when you're always worried about the next bill that you have to pay. It's hard to have room to play and experiment and create and see what's working and what's not working when your rent is due by Friday. But when you have like these things that are piling up that you have to pay off. So never be embarrassed by the odd jobs within your business that you take on. This is another like nuance, by the way, that I think we oversimplify, where people are like, hey, don't have bad customers. And they ignore the fact that often you don't know someone's a bad customer until you actually have them. But other times it's like, hey, you know what? This isn't an ideal customer, but they pay on time and they pay well, and their investment in the business is what frees you up to be able to do that play, to be able to experiment, to be able to innovate. It's easy to say, don't take customers like that, and then ignore the fact that you need cash to survive. I think that's also true with if your business isn't your main thing and it's a side hustle for you. You work a full-time job. Again, not something to be embarrassed about. You're covering your expenses so that you can approach your business the right way without the burden of cash, without the burden of having to chase the next sale, and for you to really play and experiment and figure out what works and what doesn't work. It's a lot to think about. Now, again, nothing wrong with niche. If you've niched down, if you got it keyed in, more power to you. But I think the last thing I'll say is this. What people say works for everyone does not work for everyone. Sometimes running a business is a little bit more complicated than we make it out to be. And don't confuse nuance, the presence of nuance, with worst case scenario, being hard on yourself, being unkind to yourself, or thinking that you're doing something wrong when really you're just oversimplifying a complicated thing. Sales is complicated. Sales is complicated because you're dealing with people. You're working with people. There's not a surefire lever to pull. There is no, if I just say this one thing, it'll close every customer. You're dealing with people. It's complicated. So take that with a grain of salt, and above everything else, be kind to yourself. Hey, that's today's episode. Thank you so much for listening to the podcast today. If you enjoyed this episode, don't forget to leave us a review and continue to subscribe or follow the podcast so you can keep getting good advice wherever you are. Also, remember, we support the podcast through our sponsors and members on our Patreon. You can always follow up with me on my email, blake@goodadvicecoaching.com, or you can check out our Patreon, patreon.com/goodadvice. Of course, thank you to all of you who support the podcast. It's so appreciated. Hey, that's today's good advice. We'll catch you later. See ya.